Hello, and welcome to another segment of Black Futures, Black Studies, Black Ecologies, and African Social Research. Black Futures is a public knowledge project run by the Black Studies Colloquium at Baruch College. In 2022, the Black Studies Colloquium developed a public knowledge project called Black Futures, with the generous support of the Provost Faculty Innovation Grant and the CUNY Black Race and Ethnic Studies Research Grant. Black Futures is driven by a series of questions. In what ways do studies in Black ecologies and innovative Black studies in the United States and across the African diaspora unfold and communicate with one another? What are the connections between ecological forms of oppression and socio-political legacies of colonialism within the Black diaspora? What kind of Black futures might we imagine through cultivating conversation and producing scholarship across sites of Black studies in North America, the Caribbean, South America, and Africa? In fall 2022, Black Futures hosted an online symposium featuring presentations from activists and scholars discussing a range of interpretations of Black ecologies. Black ecologies as thought and practice emerging from the study of geography, social history, the effects of climate change or disruptions in the social and natural world, the ways Black people have created their own environments to protect themselves. Videos of presentations, content by faculty, and our student scholars are all available online. We offer this material to encourage people to continue to develop materials related to Black ecologies and to continue to think about what Black ecologies, African social research, and Black studies may do to further our imagination and ideas about what Black futures can look like.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on whether you are a morning or an afternoon person. My name is Erica Richardson, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the Black Futures Symposium, Black Ecologies. So right now I have a slide up to address a slight technical difficulty. We really want to know who's in the room and of course being able to address your questions and comments. So as you're coming in, you're going to need to make a slight change. In the top hand corner of the screen, of your individual Zoom screen, if you take your cursor and hover, you'll see a mute button and then a button with 3 ellipses or 3 dots. You're going to want to click on those 3 dots so that you can have the option of renaming yourself. So I'm going to be taking this slide down shortly, but it's a pretty straightforward process. Go to the slide that is you. There'll be a mute button, and then there is a button next to it with 3 dots. You usually only see it once you take your cursor and hover. A drop-down menu will occur, and in that spot, you can rename yourself. Okay, so as I mentioned, my name is Erica Richardson. I am the co-director of the Black Studies Colloquium, and we are putting on a Black Futures Symposium. Today, we are so fortunate to have a range of speakers, researchers, activists, who are really going to help us think further about this term of Black ecologies. The Black Futures program actually began last semester with the support of the Provost Research and Innovation Grant. Last semester, we were able to put on a series of events focusing on topics including the histories and ecologies and philosophy of maroon communities, anti-racist pedagogy, feminism and aquatic life, and scavenging as a means of interrupting racial capitalism. Last semester, we also had students respond to the work of these scholars as Black Futures scholars. So what does this mean? Students wrote blog posts, they created podcasts, they more or less created public intellectual content to respond to the rigorous research of our presenters. And today, or with the symposium, that work continues with the support of the CUNY Black Race and Ethnic Studies Initiative, or the BRESI grant. We are also so fortunate to have the support of the Program on African Social Research, or PASIRI, helping us bring all these wonderful speakers together and create this conversation. And so, as I mentioned, We have the Black Future Scholar Program. Any instructors, anyone on Baruch campus, if you know of any student who might be interested, please let them know that we are recording all of our events. So even if students did not get the chance to see them or see our presentations so far, we will have recordings posted. We will also have a series of workshops to help students develop podcasts and blogs, that public intellectual content that will contribute to our larger public knowledge project. And I am now dropping the link to all this information or our main site into the chat for your access. And I'm gonna stop sharing the screen and, and hand things over to my wonderful colleague and Black and Latino Studies professor, Keisha Allen, who will be introducing our speaker and moderating the Q&A after. So Keisha.
Thanks, Erica. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Nisrin Elamin. Dr. Elamin received her Ph.D. in Anthropology from Stanford University in 2020. Her doctoral research was an ethnographic examination of the way Saudi and Emirati corporate investments in land reconfigured everyday social relations between landless and land-owning stakeholders in central Sudan. Through support from the Social Science Research Council, Wenner-Gren, and the National Science Foundation, she conducted research in local courts, farming communities, investor conferences, agribusiness farms, government ministries, and in the mosques of Sufi religious leaders, mediating land disputes in the aftermath of the large-scale land enclosures. Dr. Nisrin has published scholarly articles in Critical African Studies and a project on Middle East Political Science Journal. She's also published a number of op-eds for Al Jazeera, the Washington Post, and a cultural anthropology hotspot series. Before pursuing her PhD, Dr. Nisrin spent over a decade working in community organizing international solidarity and youth development in the US and in Tanzania. Her proudest achievement is being a parent to a 2-year-old who shares her love of chocolate, Afrobeat, and spending time in public parks and gardens. So welcome, Dr. Elamin. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be part of the series and to meet you all virtually. Before I start, I wanted to pay tribute to the many martyrs of Sudan's ongoing revolution and to the people who have made incredible sacrifices to keep its momentum going for now almost 50 months. So I'm going to now share my screen. Please let me know if you're having a hard time seeing anything. So I'm in kind of a little bit of a weird space. Okay, so on June 20th, 2022, Sudan's most influential business tycoon, Osama Dawood, announced that he's partnering with the UAE in a $6 billion deal to develop a new port along Sudan's Red Sea coast, some 200 kilometers north of Port Sudan. The deal includes a free trade zone, an international airport, and a $300 million deposit to Sudan's central bank, which would be the first such deposit since a military coup took place last October. A key feature of the deal is the expansion of a major agricultural project located 500 kilometers inland in Abu Hamad, North Sudan, along the Blue Nile. Along the Blue Nile, which will be linked to the new port through a private toll road financed by the Emirates. And as it stands, the new port would compete with and likely threaten the operation of Sudan's national port, which you can see here, ports in Port Sudan. Within days of the announcement, residents of the island of Mugarsam, who live 7 kilometers off the coast, but within the area designated for the project, voiced their dissent because it threatens the livelihood of local fisherfolks. Soon after, the Port Authority Workers Union in Port Sudan issued a statement rejecting the deal on the grounds that it undermines their main port, which has suffered a lack of government funding and support. Spatially, the project extends its reach from the northern desert areas of coastal Sudan, and this is Mugarsam here. This is the Abu Hamad project that I just mentioned. So it extends from the kind of northern desert areas of coastal Sudan inland to the agricultural heartland of northern Sudan, which is in turn connected to more established Emirati projects in and around the capital, Khartoum. Once constructed, the toll road would complete a strategic triangle encompassing an area of land slightly larger than the Emirates itself. More significant than the landscape it traverses is the access it enables to the Nile, an underground aquifer that lies underneath it, and to Sudanese soil and airspace. Through this access, the proposed project will facilitate increased Emirati control over local food production and distribution systems from farm to fork, if you will. In the words of a Gulf investor, Sudan has the land and water, and we have the technology and capital. We will help them to produce for them and for us. Sudanese government elites seem to align with this vision. In an interview with Bloomberg, Sudan's former Minister of Investment asserts, "We have vast resources and they have vast need. We just need their finance and expertise." The discourse around Sudan's need for technology and expertise is racialized, allowing Gulf investors to frame Sudan as efficient and underdeveloped, while simultaneously touting it as the next frontier for capitalist accumulation. In the process, the Gulf is framed as its binary opposite, a purveyor of expertise, financial resources, and development. And so, to its Emirati architects, the proposed port project represents on the surface one node in an ongoing strategic plan to reach Emirati food security by 2051. But such a conclusion ignores the imperial histories that enable such linearity, that place Port Sudan and Sudan's Red Sea coast at the center of Ottoman and British imperial power and extractive practices. It is this historically situated, spatialized control over Sudanese land, food, water, and air, how it is leveraged to exert particular forms of power, and how that power is in turn disrupted or partially undone by people in rural parts of Sudan who have been dispossessed by the state to facilitate Emirati capital accumulation that I'm going to focus on today. In this interest of time, I'm going to tell the story in 4 fragments. Anthropologist Anna Singh reminds us that, quote, global connections are made in fragments that interrupt stories of a unified and successful regime of global self-management, and that some fragments are more powerful than others, but honoring the fragment means acknowledging this power, but not accepting it as a done deal. I use fragments here to understand the significance of this proposed deal from the vantage point of another imperial node of power, Sudan's agricultural heartland, the Jazeera. Where Emirati but also British colonial elites before them have long used the Jazeera landscape as a blank canvas upon which to project their development visions for investments in land and agriculture. What else might we learn, as Michel Rolfe-Trouillot argues in his analysis of peasants and capital in Dominica, by shifting not only the vantage point, but also the scales of our analysis across multiple temporalities and spaces, the farm or plantation, the irrigation canal, the body, the port, to name a few. How does such a multi-scalar analysis across time and space allow us to better recognize the ways that transnational, local, and regional are intertwined in people's lives, and how capitalist post-oil development visions are disrupted at their points of reception? Before I present the first fragment, I want to talk briefly about how I'm thinking about Emirati land investments and capital accumulation in Sudan in a theoretical sense, because I'm still kind of trying to work through it and would love to hear your thoughts on this conceptual framing. So I'm hoping to contribute to an emerging literature on racial capitalism beyond the Atlantic world that remains mostly focused on the legacy of European imperialism in the global South. By focusing on a context that is shaped not only by European colonialism, but also by other forms of foreign hegemony, settler colonialism, slavery, and domination. In other words, I'm trying to deprovincialize not only the where, but also the who of racial capitalism. Because as Ruthie Gilmore reminds us, racial capitalism is not only about, quote, white people capitalism. Just to define the term, as it has been conceptualized by people like Cedric Robinson, Ruthie Gilmore, etc., who assert that racial capitalism is capitalism, as opposed to an ordering principle as opposed to a particular subcategory or stage of capitalism, and that race operates and has always operated as an ordering principle and organizing structure of modern global capitalism. My argument here is not to simply say that we can see racial capitalism and racial processes of capitalist accumulation at play in non-European contexts, but rather that we must be attentive to different and emergent forms of empire making and racialized regimes of accumulation across time and space to fully recognize the global dimensions of racial capitalism. And Gulf Arab capital accumulation in and through Sudan provides one example of an emergent form of empire making that relies on racialized and gendered processes of capital accumulation. Which brings me to the second related point I'm trying to make here, drawing on Hart and Negri's theorization of empire and processes of empire making, that they see as increasingly about, quote, capturing value from a planetary domain of social production and reproduction that is constituted by ever more complex and densely interconnected networks of communication, material and immaterial infrastructures, air, water, and land transportation. So international circuits and flows. And controlling these networks, circuits, and flows as opposed to, or in addition to territory, is and always has been as much about demarcation as it is about the purposeful erasure of lines and boundaries in order to facilitate racialized processes of accumulation. And empire making is an unstable, often contradictory process that, as Hart and Negri insist, could, quote, potentially fall to the insurgencies of the multitudes from below. Al-Baluchi and Peterson make the important point that, quote, the political dynamics of our time demand that subnational and interregional dynamics and emergent imperial formations. Within the context of Sudan's relationship to the Emirates, these interregional dynamics and emergent forms of empire making are unstable and messy, as opposed to a singular totalizing force, as all forms of empire making are and have been, in part because this power is continuously disrupted. And I hope to explore this instability ethnographically through the fragments I'm going to share today. At the center of these fragments is this Emirati-owned agribusiness farm, situated on 42,000 acres of land, some 60 kilometers south of Sudan's capital, Khartoum, along the Blue Nile, near Wadrawa. The farm produces alfalfa on a mere 6,000 acres of land, which you can see here. And it encloses all of this land, but it only uses these 6,000 acres. And it's called Zaid al-Khair after Sheikh Zayed, the former leader of the Emirates. The farm is significant in that it marks the beginning of the most recent wave of Gulf Arab investments in Sudanese land that were meant to generate foreign capital for a cash-strapped, fledgling Sudanese military regime headed by Omar al-Bashir, who was ousted by a popular revolution in April of 2019. From the early 2000s until its ouster, approximately 32 large-scale land deals were signed with foreign investors, bringing anywhere between 5 to 10 million acres of Sudanese land under their control. Of these investors, Saudi and Emirati companies have signed the largest number of leases for up to 99 years, investing $13 and $16 billion each respectively, and most of these deals remain intact. Many of the farms are used to produce cash crops like alfalfa for cows, which is then shipped to dairy farms in the Gulf. And these investments form part of a broader effort by the UAE to rebrand itself as a global investment hub, linking Africa, Asia, and Europe through the diversification of their oil-dependent economy by 2030. The land the farm sits on was taken from local communities by the state in 2001, who had been using this communal land for generations, for rain-fed sorghum and wheat farming, as well as herding. The state used a set of land laws inherited by the British colonial period to justify dispossessing people of their land because it was considered unregistered and unproductive. But the farm didn't become operational until 8 years later in 2009, in part because of local organizing resistance. So fragment 1. The construction of this irrigation canal along the Nile in 2001 confirmed Zaid al-Khair's existence to people in its surrounding communities. The canal was still in the process of being built when a local government official, angered by the fact that the land deal had been negotiated without his involvement or knowledge, and that it had brought no benefits to local communities, encouraged people to sabotage its construction. This particular official was, according to a local imam named Sheikh Khalid, quite popular and well trusted, because of the way he used his government-owned car to dole out favors to members of the communities surrounding the farm. He drove families to hospitals and funerals in nearby towns where public transport was unavailable. And so when he began rallying people to try to stop the construction of this canal, they listened. It was late August, towards the end of the rainy season, and people had witnessed how the canal had prevented the rain from draining onto the fields, allowing stagnant water to form a physical barrier between their villages and the main road. The official urged people to use anything they owned to destroy the canal, reminding them that its extension would prevent pregnant women and sick elders from reaching the hospital during the rainy season. Men from Al-Daim and its surrounding villages, who used to farm sorghum on this land, gathered after prayers on a Friday afternoon and used metal farming tools to destroy a portion of the canal that was closest to their villages. The next day, the governor ordered a convoy of armed military police to protect the canal from further destruction, and people were forced to retreat. Once the governor received word of the official's rebellious actions, he stripped him of his coveted car. A few weeks later, the official lost his job altogether. According to Sheikh Khalid, these actions were in line with the governor's warning that the government had brought the project to Al-Daim to, quote, promote agricultural development and efficiency, and that anyone opposed to it was declaring their unpatriotic opposition to the nation. A handful of men who were active in mobilizing people against the farm were imprisoned for several days before being released as a warning to others who were considering similarly rebellious actions. But Sheikh Khalid insists that, quote, the irrigation canal now makes a sharp bend away from the village that came out to destroy it, cutting through land that should have been enclosed within the project's boundaries. It serves as a reminder now to everyone, including the governor, Al-Mansouri, and the project's managers of the power local communities hold to disrupt the operation of the farm if and when they choose to. Among those who destroyed the canal that day was Sif, who, along with other dispossessed small farmers, formed a union that has strategically used civil disobedience tactics to disrupt the farm's operation since it first opened. Using civil disobedience tactics, besides bending the canal, they have destroyed its water pumps, burned tires at the farm's entrance during the manager or the owner of the farm's yearly visits. And these political mobilizations have garnered some media attention, like this article here, which documents Saif and others blocking the highway with stones and burning tires during a high-level visit to the farm. But these protests also serve to put pressure on government elites to legally recognize their demands for official titles to this land in negotiations that are mediated by local sheikhs outside of the court system. This recognition would ultimately allow dispossessed farmers like Saif to demand rental fees from the government and to formalize and secure future rights to the land the farm sits on. In Saif's own words, the rental fees are symbolic, but in the future, when the Emiratis' lease runs out, we have the right to reclaim our lands in court. Soon enough, he assured me, we'll send the Khaliji or this Emirati home. Saif's strategy here is a long-term one, informed by the fact that Gulf finance projects have historically been short-lived. From his point of view, Gulf fatigue will set in long before 2030 as the union's organizing continues to challenge and undo their post-oil development visions at their points of reception. When I ask him how they will determine who does and doesn't have rights to the land that in the past has been communal, he pauses and says, we all know who used to farm on this land, who has been farming from way back when and where one person's plot ends and another begins. So, but there are no papers required, right? I ask. He clicks his tongue in agreement. And what about the people who herd animals? I continue probing. The land never belonged to them, he answers curtly. Fragment 2, the port. In the past, colonial agents and foreign investors have invoked the Sudanese coastal region's wild desert landscape and uninhabitability as grounds for appropriation. The words of Sylvia Crossland, a British colonial agent and marine biologist, describing his first encounter of Sudan's Red Sea coast in 1912 provides one such example. He writes, "So it became to me during my first visit, great and terrible, a naked, savage land, every feature typifying thirst and starvation. But then the Brighton came, took over the bare desert and built there a perfectly modern town, quay walls that the largest ships may lie alongside, electric cranes for their cargoes, an electric light for the town, a grand opening railway bridge over the harbor, and every modern need of a great port. The electric lights, cranes, railway bridges, and walls are key to Crossland's narration of Port Sudan's transformation after its colonial seizure. He uses technology here as a discursive strategy to both justify this seizure and to silence its violent consequences. A century later, in December of 2017, during a visit to Sudan, President Erdogan of Turkey described the island of Suakin, just a few kilometers north, as a ghost island that the British had deliberately razed to the ground after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. During a speech at the University of Khartoum, where he received an honorary doctorate, he outlined his intentions to restore the island and to, quote, make it worthy of its historical glory. He then proclaimed that the British raising of this place is like shaving our beards. We will rebuild and reconstruct it in such a way that, like a shaved beard, it will regrow much more abundant. He also used the word reincarnation to signal a return to Turkey's imperial hegemony over Sudan. Erdogan, his Ottoman predecessors, and Crossland recognized the strategic geopolitical importance of Sudan's Red Sea coast and its critical role for the functioning and defense of empire. By invoking the uninhabitability and naked savagery of the landscape, they legitimized, as Catherine McKittred explains, its, quote, disembodiment and transformation into a conquerable, profitable space. If identity and place are mutually constructed, she writes, the uninhabitable spatializes a human other category of the unimaginable native Black. The geographic transformation of spaces does not fully erase the category of uninhabitable, but rather represents it through spatial processes as a sign of social difference, expressed through uneven geographies that underwrite dispossessions and desires. This latest attempt by Emiratis to acquire and transform a portion of Sudan's Red Sea coast into a multi-billion-dollar project is facilitated by the spatial processes of empire that previously disembodied and transformed it into a conquerable, profitable space. Whether or not the project materializes, it is wrapped in a similar but uniquely Emirati or Khaliji racialized ideological process of imperial transformation and extraction. And it is these uneven geographies produced through processes of imperial transformation that underwrite Gulf Arab desires and capital accumulation through dispossession. Sudan's Jazeera region, located south of the capital between the White and Blue Niles, is another key site of imperial disembodiment and extraction. Once home to the largest centrally managed irrigation scheme in the world, constructed by the British in the early 1900s, primarily to grow and extract cotton, it became an experimental model for exerting British imperial control over African tenant farmers through a public-private partnership with the Sudan Plantation Syndicate. The Dutch essayist Odette Kuhn wrote in 1930 that instead of seizing land for European plantations, the Plantation Syndicate gave the Sudanese seed, water, and technical supervision. Coercion, she writes, was indispensable because it ensured the complete cultivation and good husbandry of the irrigated area, for abandoned to himself, the native would certainly never have succeeded. Here too, the provision of seeds and water, albeit straight from the Nile, and technical supervision from technologies of control to justify and naturalize colonial extraction, capitalist accumulation, and its attendant forms of racialized coercion and violence. Writing in the late 1990s, Victoria Bernal argued that the Jazeera scheme is a stunning exemplar of colonial world-making, both literally and figuratively. She writes, its miles and miles of irrigation canals and uniform fields stretched out in a huge grid dominate space. its rigid schedules for agricultural operations command time. And above all, its hierarchy of inspectors and bureaucrats supervising, documenting, and disciplining strive to control the people of the Jazeera. It is through the imposition of this spatial geography of control that the Jazeera was transformed into a productive site of colonial extraction that Sudanese tenant farmers were forced to submit to. Underlying this transformation was the racialized assumption that Sudan's, quote, lazy, incompetent, disdainful of agriculture and idle-rich tenant farmers needed to be civilized and transformed into disciplined, hardworking peasants, as a colonial agent named Geitskill wrote in 1959. It is ultimately the brutal exploitation of their labor that allowed the scheme to function smoothly as a colonial site of production. Through their collective civil disobedience and strikes, it also ensured, though, its regular disruption. Once land is abstracted and becomes defined only in terms of property as something to which one either does or does not have a right to, it allows not only for appropriation in the present, but also in the future. In other words, the fact that land in Sudan's Jazeera region and Red Sea coast has been colonized and appropriated on multiple occasions facilitates and enables contemporary forms of foreign appropriation and extraction, while simultaneously foreshadowing their disruption. These newer forms of foreign capitalist extraction layer themselves on top of older processes of colonial dispossession, while expanding upon the racial logics that justified and enshrined them. The port is significant in facilitating capitalist extraction because it provides Emirati elites and their Sudanese partners with the ability to control not only what leaves the country, but also the quantity of food, medicine, weapons, etc. that enter it, enabling the consolidation of an Emirati and Sudanese elite capitalist class and strengthening the relationship between them. And this control is and has been used as leverage to exert Emirati control of the Sudanese economy and politics in order to facilitate their geopolitical and economic interests. Strategically controlling land along the Red Sea serves a military defense purpose for the Emirates in relation to their rivals in Iran, Turkey, and Qatar. But over the last 2 decades, Saudi and Emirati government and business elites have also used these kinds of land investments in Sudan to prop up a military regime that has proven its willingness to serve their geopolitical interests in exchange for financial support. The Sudanese regime has sent troops, for instance, to fight the war in Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf in exchange for the cash flows that large-scale land investments have enabled. Sudanese elites have used food, wheat in particular, and hunger as leverage in their latest attempts to suppress dissent and revolutionary organizing against military rule, and these tactics are in part facilitated through a relationship to Gulf Arab elites that is underpinned by investments in roads, ports, hotels, and agribusiness farms. The home. In February of 2018, Busaina, a local teacher in her 30s, school teacher who lives at the edge of the Zaid al-Khair farm, invites me and several of her neighbors over to lunch. Over tea, she explains that the Bashir regime has miscalculated how people in rural communities would respond to a cost of living crisis that was triggered by neoliberal austerity measures. We've, quote, gone from relative food security here in the Jazeera to food prices that are out of reach for most families over the last couple of years. And people have had enough of Nas al-Bashir, who have been selling our land to the Egyptians, the Emiratis, the Saudis, and up north, the Lebanese, the Jordanians. She counts the foreign investors one by one, folding each finger into the palm of her hands for emphasis, her gesture allowing us to imagine the large foreign agribusiness farms spread out like a spiderweb engulfing rural Sudan. Just as Busaina's teenage daughter begins clearing the table in preparation for lunch, the conversation shifts to the ways people are coping with the impact of this land theft in the midst of a deepening food and financial crisis. A woman named Asma turns our attention to the Zaid al-Khair farm. Asma is a landless pastoralist who lost access to vital herding land after the farm was established. Along with hundreds of landless herders and agricultural workers in the region, she had been cut out of the negotiations to formalize people's rights to this land I discussed earlier. She had mostly abandoned farming, partly because Dal, headed by Osama Dawood, who has partnered with the Emirates on this project, and the Saudi company Al-Mara'i had flooded rural markets with pasteurized, packaged milk local producers like herself couldn't compete with. Since 2013, she has spent several seasons harvesting alfalfa and stitching inflatable water pumps on the farm. Recalling the first time she met the farm's Emirati owner, Al-Mansouri, she leaned back to tell us about her first encounter. She jokes that he had arrived in a small motorcade of black cars, driving at a speed that caused a mini sandstorm. The supervisors had lined us all up in a row to greet him, but when his car stopped, he didn't step out of the car. He just rolled down his window. The next thing I remember, she continued, is him throwing packets at us from the window. Wallahi, he was like hurling them at us, and we tried to catch them. Everyone erupted in laughter at the sheer absurdity of this gesture. The packets were mostly matching scarves, hijabs, and robes, jallabiyas, that smelled, she noted, like Khaliji incense. And every woman worker ended up with either or, but none with both. She concluded that he hadn't bought enough for everyone to have a matching outfit, and instead left everyone with half of one. The clothes were made of a delicate fabric that was typically worn by Gulf Arab women inside the home, marking a particular kind of domestic piety. Most of the women who received them had tucked them away into a corner of their closet for use on special occasions. The clothes are too delicate for work, even within the home, Asma explained, and as such were not meant for any kind of daily use. For Asma, the gesture felt like an imposition of Gulf Arab charity that violated Sudanese cultural norm because it could not be reciprocated. The fact that Al-Mansouri chose to remain in the car, barely making eye contact, and maintaining a barrier between himself and his workers foreclosed any reciprocity or dignified response. On a separate occasion, Sarah, a recent graduate of a women's college in Khartoum, explains that the clothes Al-Mansouri distributes are meant to signal a particular Gulf Arab conception of domesticity and femininity that he thinks Sudanese women workers should aspire to, even if entirely out of reach given their class position and the meager wages that he gives them. When I ask her to elaborate on what that conception is, she says that she's not entirely sure, but if it is what they are exposed to through TV and social media, then what she pictures is a, quote, wealthy Khaliji woman with white skin, long silky hair, and domestic servants who is confined to her home and spends her days beautifying herself only to please her husband. In her mind, the feminist movement in Sudan fought hard for women not to be confined to the domestic sphere in this way, and this had in turn shaped Sudanese conceptions of piety and femininity, which differ across social class and region, but that are different from what she perceives Al-Mansouri to be. Both Asma and Sarah point to a unique dimension of the way Al-Mansouri is asserting his power over the women he employs. While exploiting their labor for less than $2 a day, he imposes his own racialized notion of feminine domesticity on them that requires confinement, seclusion, and idleness rather than integration into the capitalist labor market. And he does so in a paternalistic manner that reveals a colonial desire to civilize and confine the women he employs, which is at odds with the kind of labor he demands of them. In the Jazeera, agricultural wage labor has historically been performed by people of enslaved descent, as well as people of Hausa descent who settled in the region, often on their way to pilgrimage to Mecca, beginning at the turn of the 20th century, around the time the British began recruiting workers for the Jazeera scheme. Ottoman taxation policy in the 19th century led to the consolidation of land in the hands of local elites, fueling the expansion of slavery and the use of enslaved people's labor on plantations. After the abolition of slavery in the 1940s and 50s, there was an exodus of men of enslaved descent from rural parts of the Jazeera to Khartoum to work in factories, in part because of the stigma associated with agricultural wage work. The feminization of agricultural labor in the Jazeera was in part shaped by the fact that women of enslaved descent had much less mobility and alternative opportunities for work than their men counterparts. Over the last decades, non-Arab women from war-affected regions of Western and Southern Sudan and marginalized Arab pastoralist women who have lost access to grazing lands due to the climate crisis and the expansion of agribusiness have increasingly turned to agricultural wage work to make ends meet. Agricultural wage work sustains the rural economy of central Sudan, and yet the women who perform it are among the lowest paid and the most exploited. Al-Mansouri's colonial desires to civilize and confine the Sudanese women he employs is shaped by the Gulf's own history of slavery in East Africa, and ideas tying racial purity and Arab feminine piety to leisure precisely because of the prior historical presence of enslaved African women in wealthy Gulf Arab households. These desires are also tied to recent Emirati and Saudi efforts at a different scale to de-radicalize and enlighten Muslims regionally who have been led astray, particularly across the African Sahel. An example of this is the Emirati counterterrorism discourse surrounding the establishment of a new Fatwa Council and efforts to preach moderate values and to de-radicalize Muslims in countries like Mali, Chad, Somalia, and Nigeria, which are viewed as, quote, particularly inflicted with the disease of extremism. This discourse harkens back to older conceptions of African Islam or l'Islam noir as constituting an adulterated, degenerate version of Islam that stands in opposition to a more authentic, pure, and orthodox Middle Eastern Islamic core that scholars like Bowen and Arnaud have written about. In that moment, as we sat listening to Asma retell her interaction with al-Mansouri, his propensity to distribute clothes and more frequently food served as a reminder of the racial logic underpinning Gulf Arab capitalist accumulation and extraction. The Ramadan food boxes, including packaged wheat flour, sugar, and corn oil that he distributes, are processed and packaged in the UAE, but likely extracted from Sudan and other Sahelian countries. There is a coercion to this kind of charity. The same products later appear on local store shelves. In rural areas, the transition from the more nutritious sorghum and sesame oil that are traditional Sudanese foods to wheat and corn oil has been partly driven by land dispossession and by the availability of packaged halal foods from the Gulf that are advertised as more sanitary and sophisticated than local foods. As Sophie Chow argues, gastro-colonialism, or imposed alimentary regimes that perpetuate the racial violence of capitalism through the medium of equally racialized food, operates by concomitantly infantilizing and animalizing behaviors and traditional food practices. In the context of the Jazeera, Gulf Arab food charity undermines local food practices by attempting to alienate people from the subsistence foods they have grown and lived off for generations. Like the domestic clothes al-Mansouri distributes, the food packages serve to introduce and impose notions of piety, cleanliness, and sophistication into the intimate spaces of people's homes, notions that are tied to racialized ideas of Gulf Arab superiority and civilization. This is the last piece here, the body. After having worked on the Zaid al-Khair farm for 2 harvesting seasons, Fatima quit. She told me that she didn't like the way the supervisors treated her and the other women she worked with, and that they never let them take any alfalfa home for their animals. Touching her lower back, she explained that her back and chest were in pain from long hours of bending forward to pick up the alfalfa that the big harvesting machines didn't catch. It was always keep going, pick up the pace until I just couldn't anymore. I'd go home and collapse, she said. Over time, her chest pains worsened, and she found herself gasping for air while doing simple household chores. After 6 months, almost 6 months after she quit, Fatima's breathing was still belabored, as she periodically took deep breaths to fill her lungs with air. Leaning across an angareb or bed, she started scrolling through WhatsApp messages on her phone. She was trying to find the message someone had sent her about a study linking respiratory problems to exposure to the chemical fertilizers and pesticides that were frequently used on the Zaid al-Khair farm. She put her phone down after her neighbor, Suleima, insisted she stop scrolling. We all know, Suleima said, you don't have to show us, she said, with her hand pressed against Fatima's back. Even if we had proof, she continued, they wouldn't care. This act of refusal to demonstrate proof to anyone but themselves was shaped by Suleyma's intimate knowledge that would not change the farm's land use nor convince government officials to regulate their use of toxic fertilizers and pesticides. She resigned herself to no longer reasoning with anyone around what the farm managers were and weren't doing in relation to the health of the workers they hired, especially after they had repeatedly raised these concerns with local officials. The proof was imprinted on people's bodies, and it was not their responsibility to present it to anyone besides themselves. As Max Liborion points out, refusal keeps community knowledge from becoming a resource that could be used against them in terms of hiring and firing. Vanessa Agardone demonstrates, drawing on Trouillot, that the body represents another important scale of analysis from which to understand the global. And Fatima's body, the pain inflicted upon her through the farm's use of toxic chemicals to generate profit, reveals something about the ways Emirati power manifests and exerts itself at different scales across the region. It reveals something about the ways foreign investors like Al-Mansouri and their Sudanese elite partners view Jazeera land as a blank canvas upon which to project their development visions and capitalist fantasies. This is the tube that the women workers stitch. Al-Mansouri runs a blog, which is like very antiquated for the fact that he's a billionaire, about Zaid al-Khair, that is comprised of a series of photos documenting the installation of grandiose machinery and pumps that enabled the farm's operation, followed by fields of wheat and corn. There are no words on this blog, nor mention of its location, and the workers installing the farm's infrastructure are barely visible. The farm could in fact be anywhere, and this lack of specificity, the very absence of demarcation, boundaries, and lines seem purposeful here, revealing the ways the abstraction of land allows for its violent transformation. The nauseous smoke of toxic chemicals, the brutal monotony of backbending work lines, and the aggressive pumping of Nile water to nourish high-yield cash crops are all manifestations of this violence, whose burden is carried by the bodies of harvesters and by other living beings that depend on the land to survive and thrive. As one of the farm's managers tells me during a tour of the farm in February of 2018, stitching and maintaining the inflatable tubes that carry the water from the Nile to the farm's alfalfa fields and regularly weeding requires, quote, nimble hands, precision, and patience. Every worker is given a line to work on as they weed or pick crops. The lines enable overseers to identify who's lagging behind, taking a break, or slowing their pace, and the commands for a worker to pick up the pace or return to work are doled out accordingly. Like the geometric grid of the Jazeera scheme, the lines form part of the spatial geography of control that's fused with non-economic values and cultural meanings. They bring Emirati desires and visions of technological progress and order to life. As the Emirates rebrands itself as a post-oil investment hub, linking Europe, Africa, and Asia through agricultural projects in countries like Sudan, their empire-making imprints itself on the spatial geography of the farms they acquire. The elaborate irrigation systems, for instance, that facilitate the flow of water across their fenced and securitized plantations mimic the transnational flows of capital and commodity chains they aspire to control. The Sudanese workers they depend on to materialize this vision and to facilitate its linearity are in turn viewed as part of a racialized, civilizing mission that will, quote, pull poorer parts of the Muslim Ummah out of their misery, as a Saudi investor put it during an investment conference that I was at in Khartoum in September of 2016. These post-oil development visions rely on the one hand on the absence and erasure of demarcation and boundaries as they reinvent themselves as a node through which capital flows and global financial networks are redirected and strengthened, particularly as its architects reimagine the Muslim Ummah with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia at its center. Years before Sudan's ongoing revolution began in December 2018, which ousted a brutal 30-year regime and is now in its 49th month, people in rural parts of Sudan where foreign investors have acquired land or proposed investment projects foresaw its emergence. They're organizing against the government elites that were soliciting these investments, and their acts of civil disobedience aimed at disrupting the operation and functioning of the projects that actually materialized signaled to those in power in Khartoum that Sudan's countryside was mobilizing in ways they hadn't seen in decades. As Sudanese people commemorate the 1-year anniversary of a military coup that has been brutally suppressing this kind of dissent and organizing across the country, it is rural farmers and workers in Sudan's farms, factories, and ports that are giving urban youth and resistance committees at the center of power hope this regime's days are numbered. The Port Workers Union in Port Sudan along the Red Sea, for instance, has repeatedly organized strikes in protest against moves to privatize the port, which is why they had to move this project further north. Workers in the Kenana sugar factory just south of Zayed al Khair staged a 33-day strike in 2020, arguably one of the longest strikes in Sudanese labor history, and another in 2022 demanding improvements to health services, education for their children, and the reinstatement of workers fired for participating in the revolution. Mining workers and communities in South Kordofan and Sennar have successfully protested the use of toxins such as mercury and cyanide by foreign and domestic gold and uranium mining companies in their areas. What is remarkable about this sustained organizing is how explicitly anti-capitalist it has become, and how organizers of the resistance committees at the forefront of this revolution seem to be increasingly linking these demands to the need to develop a more comprehensive vision for land reform, deprivatization, and climate justice. And this vision, once fully articulated and developed, threatens to destabilize and potentially fully undo the post-oil development visions and empire-making processes of Emirati elites and their Sudanese military and business partners. And I hope that the fragments I presented here today have given you a sense of this as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elamin, for such an enriching discussion on empire-making processes and disruptions. So I will start off with questions, and of course, the audience, you can put questions in the chat as well. So my first question is, you demonstrate how ongoing processes of empire making are racialized and gendered. And you also illustrate how race, class, and gender shape different forms of resistance against these processes. So could you talk a bit about a nexus between race, class, and gender in both empire making and empire dismantling?
Sure, yes, that's a great question. I think partly what I've been seeing is the ways in which, I talked a little bit about sort of the racialized dimensions of Emirati empire making, and it's an aspect of my project that I'm kind of trying to develop by doing a little bit more studying up, by going to more investor conferences and sort of listening to the way that Emirati investors in particular are narrating this kind of agricultural civilizing mission. And I think, there's been some really great research, specifically by Adam Hania, on the ways that the Emiratis are trying to control these kind of food circuits, so that it's not so much for them about food security, but about really undermining kind of local food production systems and thereby creating new markets for themselves and also new forms of dependency. And in many ways, this is, to me, so partly what I'm trying to argue is that it's about more than just food, right? About the ways that then food gets used to facilitate a kind of larger project of empire making, of reconfiguring the Muslim Ummah with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia kind of at its center. And of course, we'll see how, it hasn't been a successful project in the sense that there's been a lot of resistance against it. But I think partly what I've been trying to say through my work is that resistance is also shaped by people's own positionality, right? So if you're somebody who's been dispossessed of land, the kind of, even after land is recaptured or a court victory is won, the privatization, the sort of the introduction of land titles often excludes marginalized folks based on their gender, on their race. And so there's a way in which even after a victory, there's still a kind of continued process of turning land into property that undermines, that really violates people's rights. And so that is why I've been trying to pay particular attention to the ways people, and I didn't talk as much about this, but the ways people who are landless are also disrupting these processes, right? So people are, for example, continuously like putting holes into the fences of these agribusiness farms, getting through the fences and hurting their land and hurting the animals on the land. And the farm's managers they have a strong relationship with the local police, will hire police to then shoot people, literally. And it's often women who are hurting their animals on this land. And then they have to like pay a fee per cow that gets released and so forth. So it's also a way of kind of dispossessing people in terms of monetarily. But yeah, these kind of more, and the people have been doing seed bombing and sort of taking parts of the land and growing food on it without, as you can see, a lot of the land was not used. And so these kind of more mundane or less visible forms of resistance, I think, are also very important to pay attention to, because they articulate a different kind of vision of what land reform might look like in Sudan from the perspective of people who have been landless for a very long time.
Okay, thanks so much for that. That brings me to my next question. So I was so moved by the story of Fatima. And Fatima, like, she experienced respiratory problems from exposure to toxins. And you mentioned that she had a discussion with a friend and a colleague. She was trying to show that, scrolling on her phone to show that these are the effects of exposure to toxins on farms. And a friend tells her, you don't need to show me anything. There's no sense in proving anything. And I think about a colonial subject and having to bear the burden of proof that we are human and not animal, having to bear the burden of proof. But I see this sort of resistance or this refusal as liberating and an act of resistance as well, because of the constant burden of proof, having to sort of show that you're human, that you should be valued. So I thought that was really powerful as well. And also another question, comment question. You talk about racial capitalism, and I would like to know what your project sort of emphasizes and what is missing on discourses on racial capitalism.
Yes, thank you. And this is something I would love to also hear your thoughts on, because I'm still kind of trying to think through it. But I think part of it is, for me, I've been thinking about how the sort of, obviously it's a very long sort of, the theorization of racial capitalism has a long history, and it kind of emerged, I'm not too big on sort of the genealogy of where something emerged, but of course, people have written about like South African theorists and thinkers having theorized racial capitalism from their perspective in the context of kind of apartheid South Africa. And so I guess I'm thinking in part about how the renewal of that discourse and kind of conversations around racial capitalism, especially in the US, and I think also probably the European Academy to a degree, have mostly focused on the Atlantic world, right? And for me, I'm really interested in part of my work at looking at the afterlife of slavery in Sudan, because it's very much shaped just the history of land dispossession and kind of efforts to reclaim land. And to really think about racial capitalism beyond the Atlantic world in contexts that are shaped not only by European colonialism, but also by, in this case, other forms of kind of foreign domination, settler colonialism. We have a pretty unique relationship to the Gulf, even though like these countries are much younger than ours in many ways. So I'm kind of interested in having more conversations about that. Like how can we, because, of course, if racial capitalism is capitalism, then we also need to kind of examine the global dimensions, the planetary dimensions of it, right? And especially, I think that's made ever more urgent because of the climate crisis. Thinking through that, but I'd love to also hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think what's important when you mention as well that you're focusing on not necessarily European colonialism, but you're looking at, the fact that capitalism what is happening in Sudan and the fact that, you know, the Emirati land investments, you're looking at racial capitalism in that way and how it's shaped by, again, beyond just race, food practices as well, because you mentioned the Ramadan boxes and and not only food, but clothing, the clothing that's distributed. So it transcends races. It's you see it in the food as well, but it's also connected to race as well. So I thought the food practices that you mentioned were important. I thought also looking at the clothing, the discursive practices are there as well, and the discourse around, you know, the natives as being animalistic and that sort of thing. But I think your analysis of the food I found profound, and the clothing. So I think looking at that and looking at how all of that is still connected to forms of racial capitalism, I think is important as well. So yes, I thought that was great. And there's so much that I can ask, but I don't want to solely dominate the conversation. If anyone else has a question, I see Dr. Richardson mentions that protest through the mundane seems like an apt counter to the technologies of empire. Thank you for telling us about these examples of what Sudanese people are doing. And also when I thought about, you know, what's happening as well, and you talk about the feminization of agricultural labor, I found that to be quite interesting as well. And looking at this discourse around women and their hands being nimble and suited for this type of work, and how perhaps women are resisting that sort of feminization of agricultural labor, if you're exploring that in your work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I've found really powerful is I have like different sites where I did my research and also harvested with women, and so in another kind of farm not too far from the one I was describing, there's a group of women who, so at the beginning of the revolution, they were getting paid, I think, 50 cents per day, like US, for a fairly long shift. And this was, and so they organized like basically a strike to kind of demand higher wages. And I think it's gone up to 2 now, which with inflation actually hasn't made that big of a difference. But the fact that they were able to negotiate that, I think is really powerful. And I mean, you know, some of them are relatives of mine. So I've talked to them about this. Part of their vision is to form a cooperative and to own their own land, because they're landless. So and some of them are more recently landless. So some of the women who consider themselves Arab have recently, through these kind of processes of land dispossession, been dispossessed, and have as a result joined the agricultural kind of wage work because they just haven't had any other opportunities for work. And so in conjunction with the other women that have been landless for much longer, they've been talking about the possibility of forming a small farming cooperative with kind of diaspora funding, which, yeah, it's something that like we're in conversation with like sort of members of the family and so forth. And I think that kind of model, I mean, it's existed before in Sudan, so it's not like a new thing necessarily, but I haven't seen many examples of women-led cooperatives. Like in the past, when agriculture was more sort of male-dominated, there were examples of that, of sort of male farming cooperatives, but this would be quite unique. And I think just even the way that they're thinking about land use, sort of organic farming and sustainability is also really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there a hand up I saw there? I see a hand up somewhere, but if
yeah,
not,
I had my hand up,
okay.
and then other hands are coming up, which is great.
Okay.
So again, thank you so much for this very rich, rigorous, and just fascinating work. Going back to, I guess, the question you've brought up of like how you're in the process of thinking about racial capitalism, and trying to think about it outside of like sort of the confines or the structures just of the Atlantic. And what I was noticing or thinking about that was so useful for me in your presentation was how it's not just about naming the way racial capitalism unfolds. Like we're seeing like these multiple historical ideologies and legacies that like lead up into and continue into our present moment. Settler colonialism, empire, legacies, afterlives of slavery. But I also was thinking about when you mentioned the port union with the protests to resist privatization and to really thinking about the land in terms of in a more comprehensive way, to think about climate justice, to think about alternative structures. And I think part of like the challenge of trying to name racial capitalism is trying to think outside of it. There is this way in which like everything gets sort of subsumed into the logics of capitalism, especially in terms of what is the profit, what is the land doing, but always doing it towards this very strict monetary sense and not necessarily towards this sustaining life. And so maybe it's like another way of thinking about it, or sort of expanding the conversation, is to flip it. It's like we can recognize what racial capitalism does by seeing in part what the alternatives bring forth. And I thought particularly it's in this moment of protest that we do get to incorporate something like climate justice. Like that becomes a central factor. And on that same point, I was just curious to know like what kinds of conversations or what are the ways like at least with the port protesters, and that might have just been one examples, but I thought that was interesting how through the act of protest, we start to deconstruct our ways of thinking about the land and how it functions. And then we can bring in other ways of thinking and relationality that's not just centered on profit and profit by the few. And so I was just wondering what sort of led you to that observation or conclusion about what the protesters were doing that was different? Because that might be a way of thinking what is racial capitalism not. So yeah, it's like working with the material that you have, but like ever so slightly switching the frame and changing this from a long comment into a question. I guess I would like to hear just a little bit more about what you saw like amongst those protesters or with the port union.
No, those are great questions, and I just really appreciate that comment. So, I mean, I haven't worked so much directly with the port union. I've worked more with like farmers unions, like the one that SAFE was kind of part of and is part of, and they've done sort of everything from these kind of sabotage, civil disobedience tactics to then trying to go through the court system, and I think what I've observed is the ways that kind of fed into the revolution or feeds into the revolution, because, you know, and I don't know I'm trying to remember the exact statistics, but like, I think 60 to 70% of Sudanese families rely on agriculture, at least partly, to make a living. So we're talking about like the majority of the country, basically. And there have been these huge changes in land ownership, and the precedent, the legal precedent that sets, you know, is going to have repercussions for really generations. And so to me, what I'm most hopeful about is the ways that, and this is something I'm going to go back in December to do more research about, but there's like a landless workers union as well that is currently sort of starting to organize, and they're thinking about land in some ways outside of capitalism, right? Like, and that's actually very exciting. I don't think it's really ever, I've never seen discussions like that before, at least not in my lifetime. And so, and you know, I've talked to my father about this as well. And so, yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say yet because I haven't done enough research on this, but it's sort of a new research direction that I'm interested in, right? Like, what are people's alternative visions of land reform, especially from the perspective of people who have long been dispossessed, you know? Thank you for that.
Oh, do we have another question? Another hand up? If not, I guess I can.
Zach's
Zach?
here.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Thank you so much for that, Nisrin. That was a really fascinating talk, and I'm happy to see how your research is progressing. I guess I have 2 points that I want to raise. First, you know, I think the issue that you just discussed around racial capitalism and kind of alternate imaginations around land use. You know, our speaker yesterday, Christina Stormer from MST, really hit that question on the head as well. And they're doing a lot of really interesting stuff, which I know you are aware of in the Brazilian context. But I would be super fascinated to hear a conversation between Sudanese and Brazilian activists around the question of land. But I guess my two kind of comments, questions, the first on the question of racial capitalism, which you asked for feedback on. I think it might be useful to hear from you more directly, what are the differences that Erica kind of hinted at in her question as well. Because, when I think of racial capitalism, it's hard to disentangle that from notions of white supremacy. And obviously, when we're dealing with the racial context of the Horn and the Gulf states, as your own work sort of makes clear, the racial fluidity is a very different dynamic. And I think that's something that I'm always kind of fascinated in, especially in contexts where, unlike in the West, where you have these very strict legal regimes that define race as particular categories of meaning, in the Gulf, in Sudan, as your own work makes clear, race doesn't operate in a similar legalistic fashion, especially around the context of who is an Arab and how that gets defined. So, I think that's actually a really useful way to extend our understandings of racial capitalism, and I think you were probably ideally situated to try to to reconceptualize it in that way. And my question, I guess, would be around the issue of sort of rural urban protests in Sudan. So as again very well. The protests that broke out in 2019 were fueled largely by sort of rural activists coming into the urban spaces, and that is what made them distinctive in some ways from previous eras of uprisings in Sudan. And I guess what I'm really curious about here, and I don't know enough, are we seeing a kind of circular dynamic in terms of the rural protests now? Right. So do you see urban activists trying to forge relationships with what's happening in these rural areas? Do you see like actual migration from urban areas or just participation of urban activists in these rural struggles? Or have they again reverted back to kind of a compartmentalized approach where what happens in the rural area is delinked from what's happening in the urban spaces and hence from some of these bigger national questions that you're trying to foreground?
Yeah, no, these are all, first of all, thank you so much for that comment about kind of race and sort of fluidity and I think I want to just briefly say that I think there is still sort of, because the Gulf itself was colonized a little, by the British, there's also the ways in which white supremacy and kind of the legacy of British colonialism impacts their own empire making and their sort of own ways of thinking about expertise and what they're bringing and so forth. But I do think that there is something, like I'm trying to angle the way that Emirati empire making is like different from British and Ottoman empire making, and kind of in this very paternalistic sort of racialized way, right? And they see themselves as like they talk of themselves in relation to Sudan as like in terms of brotherhood, which is also quite gendered, but it's also racialized, that project, right? And sort of thinking about that and in specific ways that it is something that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. So thank you for that. In terms of the rural urban, this is also something that going home in December will kind of probably try to keep my eye on more. I just had a conversation with some people affiliated with the neighborhood resistance committees last week who are trying to figure out how to develop a more comprehensive kind of platform around land reform. And can people hear me? Is it okay. And so, one of the things that I've been talking to people about is like, you need to link up with these unions, right? They have a very like laid out platform. There's a union in the Jazeera scheme that it doesn't, I don't necessarily deal with, but I've had many conversations with that are very clear about what they want moving forward, which is more of a kind of public-private partnership model around agricultural development, where people can hold on to their land, similar to the cooperative I was mentioning. But they want, like, if a Saudi wants to come and invest, then they can do that. Of course, the question is, the legal framework has to change to protect people, right? Because I don't really trust. Nobody really trusts some Emirati investor coming in and partnering with a local farmer without there being some type of profit motive. But the thing that's been really interesting is to see the neighborhood resistance committees in places like Wad Madani, which is in the Jazeera, so it's a rural part of Sudan, but a bigger town. So in rural towns, some of these resistance committees have put out platforms that are actually, in my mind, more radical, more comprehensive than the ones that have been put out by the Khartoum resistance committees, for obvious reasons. And I think they're in the process of kind of coordinating with each other. But to me, that's also something that maybe people are, I think, engaging with at the moment, is the ways in which certain resistance committees and their politics get kind of valued, especially in the eyes of in the international community, right? When some of them are occasionally brought to the table for consultations, etc., where the rural organizing bodies get cut out. And I think that's, again, I'm not a proponent of the international community getting involved in any of this, but it is a way in which then class and sort of access to the centers of power shapes the way that the politics from these resistance committees is seen as being representative of all of them, right? And I think that is problematic. So I think, again, I don't really have an answer to your question, but I think it's an excellent one, and it's one that I think both people are grappling with, but also that in the future will become even more significant as we move as hopefully we move to a post-military regime era, so.
If does anyone else have any questions, any comments? Yeah. I guess my final question before we close off, because we have to close off at 12:30, is when you talk about a shape-shifting, contradictory, unstable nature of empire-building processes, and you talk about the generative possibilities, I wonder if you could talk a bit about the limitations of this transgressive structure.
Can you say that again? The limitations of what, sorry?
The limitations of the transgressive structure of empire-building processes. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the limitations?
Well, I mean, I think, so, okay, and I apologize for being sort of glib. I don't know if the word is glib about this, but the Saudis and the Emiratis are very fond of these big grand visions, right? Like Vision 2030, post-oil, diversifying they have, if you go on their websites, you'll see it's this huge, even if you drive in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, you'll see billboards everywhere for whatever the next vision is that they've come up with. It's obviously a very top-down vision. I'd be curious to see if there's people certainly within the Emirates who are kind of critical of it as well. But they seem to be, on the surface, they look like these grandiose kind of very they're often tied to green capitalism and discourses that are popular in Europe and North America around kind of divestment from fossil fuels, etc. But I mean, when they actually hit their point of reception, whether it's in Sudan, Mauritania, Pakistan, they have projects all over. Sometimes they don't materialize at all. Al-Mansouri apparently got money. Part of the reason it took so long for it to take off was the opposition from local communities, but it was also him not being able to figure out how to get proper funding and so forth. So I think they're messy and contradictory at multiple levels. And it's interesting to me because they keep coming up with new ones, and somehow the old ones get sort of discarded. And again, I think that's partly why they're unstable. It's partly because of the sort of resistance against them, right? And people kind of saying this is not, stay out of our business. Part of what I was really impressed by during the revolution was people, and continue to be people making that linkage and saying, Emirates, stay out of our business. You don't have any say in controlling our politics. And they're trying to do more of this across the Sahel. And I think people are just not buying it so sorry, I'm kind of, but yeah.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that. So just a final comment that, thank you for being so beautiful, specific about the people affected by this empire building. So you just have a comment there from someone, it's Hamid Cindy. Yes. So that's just a final comment there. But no, thank you for such an enriching discussion on empire building processes and disruptions. I think we are all enlightened. I learned so much about Sudan's Red Sea coast and the Nile, and how that is sort of part of that empire building process as well, through land, sea, air, etc. So thanks so much for sharing your presentation and giving such a great discussion today. So I'll turn it over to Erica, who will close off today's discussion.
Yes, I just also wanted to say thank you. I'm so honored to be part of this series, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing the recordings of the other ones, because we're at this faculty retreat, so I wasn't able to. And I apologize for I'm in some type of the noise. I'm sorry for that.
No worries. It's always like a space where you think it's always quiet, and the moment you sit in it, it's like everything just converges. Yeah. It's the golden rule. It's always what happens. But I want to echo what Keisha said. Thank you so much for a brilliant and beautiful presentation. I have I can't wait to read about this. I hope, is there a book coming out?
Inshallah.
Keep us posted, because I think the way you attend to the local strategies and significance, and how people, whether they're in their homes on the land, thinking about the quality of the cloth, thinking about whether or not this land actually produces food that people eat that is nutritious, or is it just some Western concept of what food should be. Even what you said about the blog, I think it sticks with me, because to me that seems like another extension of what you were saying about technologies, technologies that are used in violent ways, and how we can interrogate these different things, to really think about what it means to borrow some of the language from our previous speakers, to transform the land and our relationship to it. And so on that note, I have to thank you so much, and encourage people to show up again in a half hour or so for our last presentation. I'm going to briefly share the screen just so people have a sense of it. It's going to be the same Zoom link. So in a half hour or so, we will be coming back, and Nisrin, I will also send you the link to all the recordings. So I'm really hoping that this is just a foundation for us to continue to build a conversation. Again, thank you, everyone. And I'm now going to stop